Hey, thank you, Maria. Let me get this screen shared. Is that coming through?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. Again, thanks everyone for joining. And the M5 and the previous forecasting competitions have taught us a lot about the potential of the latest and most sophisticated forecasting methods, and also through the reporting of the naive models and other simple benchmarks. They've shown us what level of forecasting performance should be achievable by all organizations with relatively little cost or effort. But there's a challenge that remains. The real-life practice of forecasting in organizations, what we often call business forecasting, pretty much universally fails to achieve the performance demonstrated by the winners of the forecasting competitions. And even more disappointing, real-life business forecasts are often worse than simple benchmarks or even naive models. Now, as touched on yesterday by Paul Goodwin and the UFO project panel, forecasting in organizations is generally done quite poorly. We've come to realize that real-life business forecasting is as much a problem with process and organizational psychology as it is a problem with math and data. Of course, the M5 dealt with the math and data issues. It showed us the state of the art in modeling and methods to achieve the most accurate point forecasts and the most precisely estimated uncertainty distributions. But forecasting process participants, those folks who review, adjust, approve, and ultimately use forecasts in their decision-making, they don't always have forecast accuracy as their top priority. And these process participants may also disregard uncertainty estimates, especially when that uncertainty is extremely high and deemed to be uninformative. Also, as Ellen Bennell mentioned on the UFO panel yesterday, planning systems are largely unable to make use of anything but point forecasts. So where does that leave us? Was the M5 just a mathematical exercise that's ultimately irrelevant to forecasting in organizations? Well, not so to maybe Target and Walmart, as we've heard this afternoon, but I think there is a danger for the large majority of organizations that don't have that level of talent and sophistication in their forecasting groups. There is that danger unless we can bring M competition findings to the attention of these organizations, as the UFO project is attempting to do, and show organizations a better path forward through systematic forecasting. Now, while there are several specific takeaways from the M5 that I'll touch on later, the competition has one overarching benefit, and that is that it's re-exposing and reaffirming that huge gap between forecasting theory and forecasting practice, and showing the great opportunity for the use of systematic forecasting in organizations. So let's begin by looking at the usage of forecasting in organizations. It's long been recognized that the practice of forecasting falls well short of that potential exhibited in the research and by the M competitions. For example, in IGF editorials as far back as 1986, Chris Chatfield bemoaned the state of forecasting practice and called on statisticians to find better ways of communicating to practitioners so they would better use existing methods. In 1992, Randall Schultz pointed out the huge gap between the development of forecasting techniques and their application. In 2000, Michael Lawrence highlighted the lack of progress toward Chatfield's goal. He deplored the lack of research devoted to studying the causes. He stated that if we don't support and encourage this line of research, it is possible that in another 13 years, there will be another editorial lamenting the lack of progress in getting business to make the use of available forecasting technique. Which brings us to today, not 13, but 21 years since Lawrence, and a new editorial by Files and Goodwin, where they assert it is surely time to understand more of what is going wrong in translating innovative, successful methods from the research bench into organizational practice. So in the 35 years since Chatfield's editorial, which corresponds almost exactly to the time I began my professional career and got started in business forecasting, what progress have we made, and how can the M5 help? Well, we know over the last 60 plus years since Robert G. Brown's publication of exponential smoothing, that progress has been made. Perhaps not by an earth-shattering amount. It's not like we're now getting perfect forecasts, but there is convincing evidence that forecasting methods have improved over time. In IGF's special M4 issue, published in January 2020, there's a really interesting and important article by Spiros, Rob Heidemann, and Fotios on forecasting in social settings, the state of the art. By social settings, they're talking about forecasting outside physical sciences. So this includes business forecasting. It's a lengthy article touching on many topics, but for our purposes, the key section is an analysis of the top methods from M1, M3, and M4 compared to each other across data from each competition and compared to benchmark methods like the naive forecast. It's been observed, for example, in a discussion paper by Stefan Klaassen on IGF's M4 issue, that rankings can vary somewhat depending on the particular performance metric being used. We can see that here with MAPE, SMAPE, and MAZE. However, it is very apparent that the F-Forma method, which finished second in the M4 point forecast, clearly outperforms the top methods from M1 and M3. So progress is being made. Now, I haven't seen this table updated for M5, but we do know that the top performers for point forecast delivered over 20% improvement over the top performing benchmark, bottoms-up exponential smoothing. Compared to M4, where the top performers had less than a 10% improvement compared to the COMB benchmark, which was a simple average of single exponential smoothing, damped, and hold. Curiously and importantly, as it's been pointed out, the gains in the top performing methods in M5 occur mainly at the top and middle parts of the hierarchy. There's 40% improvement at the top, most aggregated level, around 23% improvement in the middle levels, and just a 3% at the bottom, most granular levels. This is important because as a planner making decisions about supply and inventory, you ultimately need to take action at the most granular level, which here is product store. So what this means is that such a planner could rely on a much simpler and faster exponential smoothing for these low-level forecasts without sacrificing much accuracy. Now, nobody's going to claim that forecasting competitions are perfect representations of reality. They certainly aren't. But competitions like the M4 and M5 do provide something of a laboratory environment to test new methods and compare to long-standing benchmarks. They let us assess whether progress is being made by all the new methods being developed. If we look again at the M4 results, nearly every contestant beat naive 1, the no change model, which is our most basic benchmark. Top contestants outperformed naive 1 handily, reducing error by 20 to 25%, depending on what error metric you use. In M5, we see the top teams easily outperforming the benchmarks, even though overall only 40% of the teams beat naive 1, and only 7.5% beat the bottoms-up exponential smoothing. So this tells us, at least in theory, that organizations using good methods ought to be able to forecast better than doing nothing and just using the latest observation in their forecast. But surprisingly, when it comes to real-life business forecasting, this isn't as easy as it sounds. In a disturbing series of articles published in Foresight starting in 2013, in which were inducted into the Foresight Hall of Fame, Steve Morlich reported on his studies of business forecasting as it is being practiced in real life. In one study of 8 consumer and industrial companies, over 17,000 products, and over 300,000 forecasts, an astounding 52% of their forecasts failed to improve upon naive 1. Of course, just by chance, even a good forecasting method will sometimes be less accurate than a naive model in some periods. That's not surprising. Of course, for some time series, such as when there's a high degree of correlation from one period to the next, the no change forecast can be quite accurate. You might not be able to improve upon it. But for the majority of time series we face in business forecasting, it seems like we ought to be able to do better. We ought to be able to forecast better than the naive. So it's just a disappointment that these companies were spending time and resources generating forecasts, yet up to half the time they would have done better doing nothing and just using the naive. And the disappointment doesn't end there. Instead of looking at the percentage of individual forecasts that fail to beat the naive, we can look instead at the overall average of performance compared to the naive. this improvement can be surprisingly small. I've not seen a lot of publicly available data on this, but a good example comes from a Noel Rubbermaid presentation made in a conference at 2011. Noel Rubbermaid reported their average forecast error across all their products was 38%, while a naive forecast would have had a 40% error. This amounts to just a 5% reduction from 40 to 38%, compared to the 20+% reduction in error in the best M competition methods. This is not a unique case, it's just that most companies haven't undertaken this sort of analysis or shared their results publicly. Business forecasting can be a highly politicized process within an organization. Paul touched on this yesterday. The internal politics and personal agendas of the participants can lead to many worse practices. I'm sure this isn't a surprise to anyone who's worked in business forecasting positions or who, as a researcher or consultant, has spent time embedded in organizations and seen how business forecasting is actually done. Upper management will want to over-forecast, essentially creating stretch goals to try to motivate increased sales. A sales rep asked to forecast their own expected sales might be inclined to sandbag, forecasting low to look like a hero when their sales come in higher and they get a bigger bonus. Files and Goodwin, in their Foresight Hall of Fame paper from 2007, cite a retail organization that chronically over-forecasted. Turns out they weren't estimating the most likely level of future demand, but were trying to determine the level of demand that only had a small chance of being exceeded, so they would limit their stockouts. Problem here is if the company accountants were expecting higher revenue based on the biased forecast, the company could get itself into financial trouble. Also, organizations can become enamored with elaborate consensus and collaborative processes, assuming all the human touch points will make the forecast better. But too often, like too many cooks in the kitchen, each human touch point is just another opportunity to contaminate what should be an objective, dispassionate, and unbiased forecast. Even if organizations were to adopt state-of-the-art forecasting software employing the latest proven advances from M4 and M5, and we have no assurance of the organization's management that they would actually use these forecasts in their decision-making and planning. They might just manually override the forecast into something acceptable to them, but completely unrecognizable from what the software generated. I said at the beginning that the overarching benefit of M5 to organizations is that it re-exposes and reaffirms the gap between the state of the art shown in research and competitions and the real life practice of forecasting. The M5 results show, at least to anyone who's paying attention, that there's a great opportunity to improve both the accuracy of our point forecasts and our understanding around these forecasts, or the uncertainty around these forecasts. But the first step toward fixing any problem is to recognize there is a problem. Now, in a sense, organizations recognize there's a problem with forecasting. Because in all my years in the profession as a practitioner, consultant, forecasting software vendor, I've never heard anyone complain their forecasts are too accurate. On the contrary, poor forecasting is often blamed as the root cause of any of their operational failures, like poor service or excess inventory. While organizations may recognize that they have a forecasting problem, they generally fail to understand the nature of their forecasting problem. So I'm going to suggest a way to help organizations recognize the real problem and get them on a path toward more systematic approach to forecasting so they can truly benefit from the learnings of the M competitions. Just like with any intervention, you may have to begin with a wake-up call or slap in the face. So I'll start with my slap in the face. And that's that forecasting is a huge waste of management time. Now, this doesn't mean that forecasting is pointless and irrelevant. It doesn't mean that forecasting isn't useful and necessary to run our organizations. And it doesn't mean that business managers and executives should stop caring about their forecasting issues or stop trying to resolve them. It just means that the amount of time and effort and resources spent on forecasting is not commensurate with the benefit achieved, the improvement in accuracy. Organizations spend far too many resources generating, reviewing, adjusting, and improving their forecasts, while almost invariably failing to achieve the level of accuracy desired. Evidence shows that a large proportion of typical business forecasting efforts fail to improve the forecast or even make it worse. For example, in Files and Goodwin's paper, they report that for the non-retail companies in their study, 1/3 of the positive adjustments to the forecast were in the wrong direction. So the conversation needs to change. We need to broaden our focus. While the M5 can show us the potential for the math and data side of forecasting, we need to complement this with attention to the forecasting process itself, its efficiency and its effectiveness. Before an organization can hope to become great at forecasting, they need to stop shooting themselves in the foot and doing things that have no effect, just make the forecast worse. That's what the notion of forecast value added is all about. Now, I'm going to spend the next few minutes illustrating FVA. I want to show how application of FVA can inform an organization of the true nature of the forecasting problems and open their eyes to the potential for systematic forecasting and the benefits of the M competition findings. So let's take a look at a typical business forecasting process. You begin with your data, some proxy for demand. It could be your sales or shipments or orders, and maybe some additional variables like pricing and promotional activities. That feeds into your forecasting software. It may be commercial software like SAS or SAP or Forecast Pro. It could be open source, or in most cases, it's just Excel. That software generates what we'll call the statistical forecast, which can then be reviewed and overridden by a forecast analyst or demand planner. It may then go into a more elaborative, collaborative, or consensus process where sales, marketing, finance, and other people may provide their inputs to make further adjustments. And in many organizations, the final executive approval step, where a general manager or division president can make some final adjustments and finally bless the forecast for feeding into downstream planning systems. So the typical business forecasting process consumes large amounts of management time and company resources. And we know that the process participants can inflict their biases and personal agendas on the computer-generated number, especially if what the computer says is not what they want to see. With an FVA approach, the important question is not what accuracy did our product achieve, but rather, is our process adding value? That is, are we making the forecast more accurate and less biased through all our efforts? How would we ever know? Well, there are dozens of traditional metrics like MADE and like MAD and all the flavors of MADE, but by themselves, they don't answer the question. Morlich has a nice quote. It says that forecast performance can be quickly improved if you know where to look, but that conventional metrics like MAPE shed little light on the issue. So sure, these common metrics can tell you the magnitude of your forecast errors, but by themselves, they don't tell you how efficiently you are at achieving that level of accuracy, or whether you're forecasting any better than some cheaper alternative method like a naive model. These are the sorts of things that FVA aims to find out. FVA is defined as a change in a forecasting performance metric that can be attributed to a particular step or participant in the forecasting process. It's measured by comparing the results of a process activity to the results you would have achieved without doing that activity. So FVA can be positive or negative. You can think of FVA as the application of basic scientific method to forecasting. You start with a null hypothesis that your forecasting process has no effect. You can then measure the results of steps in the process to determine if you can reject the null hypothesis and thereby conclude that there is an effect, either good or bad. It's a nice analogy to testing a new drug for safety and efficacy. Suppose you have a new pill that's claimed to cure the common cold. You find 100 people with colds, you randomly divide them into two groups, give one group the pill and the other placebo. You then track their outcomes and you might find that the pill had a beneficial effect. However, if there's little difference between the groups, or if the ones taking the pill fare worse, you can probably conclude that the pill adds no value. We are applying the same kind of thinking with FVA analysis, with the naive forecast serving as a placebo. Now, as a side note, FVA is all about identifying and eliminating process waste. So it's consistent with a lean approach to forecasting. If you determine there are steps in your process that are not making the forecast any better, then it can be safe to eliminate them. Any resources involved in those non-valuating steps can be redirected to more productive activities. For example, when I worked at Oscar Mayer Foods, it sounded like a good idea to require salespeople to provide forecast updates each week. These were aggregated and fed into the consensus planning process. However, after tracking the Salesforce inputs for several months, we realized they weren't making the forecast any more accurate. We were just wasting their time. It was actually more productive for the salespeople to be out playing golf, building relationships with customers, and actually making sales. And they were certainly a lot happier doing that than faxing in their forecasts each week. So let's look at an example of a simple forecasting process. The simplest process is to simply read demand in your forecasting software and then have an analyst review and possibly override that forecast. In FA analysis, we would compare the analyst override to the computer-generated forecast. Is the override making the forecast better? FA also compares both the computer forecast and the analyst forecast to the naive forecast, the placebo. Here's an example of what we call the stair-step report for showing results of an FVA analysis. These are numbers I mentioned earlier from Newell Rubbermaid, presented at an IBF conference across all their products. The first column shows the sequential process steps. The second column shows the error achieved at each step. The rightmost column shows the pairwise FVA comparisons. This format can be used to report an individual product location, a group, or as in this example, an aggregation of all the products. Now, as you see, the statistical forecast reduced error by 5 percentage points compared to the naive. But the manual adjustments to the statistical forecast increased error by 3 percentage points. This is not an uncommon finding. Here are more details from the 2007 Files and Goodwin paper I cited earlier. They studied 4 supply chain companies and 60,000 actual forecasts. They found 75% of the time an analyst adjusted the statistical forecast, a lot of time was being wasted. They were trying to figure out, like FVA does, whether the judgmental adjustments made the forecast any better. In this chart, they divided the adjustments into quartiles based on the size of the adjustment and also whether the adjustment was up or down. We found that large adjustments, quartiles 3 or 4, tended to improve the forecast, particularly large downward adjustments, shown in red. They also observed that small adjustments had virtually no impact on accuracy, either positive or negative, which when you think about it, makes perfect sense. If you make a small adjustment, even if directionally correct, you've made at best a small improvement in the accuracy, so why bother? FVA isn't meant to be anything sophisticated or complex, and there isn't a rigid cookbook or recipe to follow in doing the analysis. It's meant to be more an attitude or a mindset, taking a critical look at the forecasting process, identifying process waste, and trying to streamline it. It's focused less on the ultimate accuracy the process achieved and focused more on the efficiency, how efficiently the process was able to achieve that accuracy. Now, we know that forecast accuracy is ultimately limited by the nature of the behavior being forecast, and there's always going to be an element of randomness in any behavior. So this mindset is also meant to discourage organizations from making heroic efforts to achieve levels of accuracy that are simply not achievable. Listed here are some of the many companies that have explored FVA with their own data and talked about it publicly, taking the basic simple ideas and in some cases developing new ways of visualizing and analyzing the data. Now, since the FVA approach is meant to be objective and scientific, you must be careful not to draw conclusions unwarranted by the data. Paul Goodwin has provided several points of caution. For example, measuring FVA over just a few periods is, of course, not enough data to draw valid conclusions. Period to period, FVA can go up and down for short periods of time. FVA may be particularly high or low just due to chance. Be aware, next, that FVA results can vary somewhat depending on the metric used. And also be aware that doing FVA with relative error metrics like the popular maze, while you can still do it, they can make the results more difficult to interpret. Also, it can make sense to use a seasonal naive rather than naive one when dealing with seasonal data. Now, there have been a number of misunderstandings and misinterpretations of FVA along with questions and critiques, so let me go through a few of them. First, when talking about value, we aren't monetizing anything, and we aren't talking about the ultimate value of forecast in terms of better decision making. We're simply talking about improving forecast accuracy versus making it worse. So as I've heard both Paul Goodwin and John Boylan mention, it probably should be called FAA for forecast accuracy added. And while it's probably too late to change the name now, I think that's a very valid point. Another comment I've heard intended as a criticism is that the math around FVA is trivial. That is true. we're essentially just looking at the difference in average performance between naive forecasts, computer-generated forecasts, and the various stages of human adjustment. FEA is intended to provide a quick and dirty view into what's going on in the forecasting process. It's intended to be simple enough that virtually any organization could do the analysis themselves. As a role model, I'd point to statistical process control. They work well in industry because they're simple enough to be applied by a manufacturing line operator with a high school education, and they don't require a PhD in statistics. I've also seen a suggestion that FEA somehow encourages collaborative multi-step forecasting processes. In fact, FEA was designed to do just the opposite of that. FEA analysis is a way to expose the inefficiencies and accuracy being destroyed by overly elaborate forecasting processes. Finally, regarding probabilistic forecast, I myself have not done any work expanding FEA into this area, but I'd refer you to a Foresight paper by Stefan de Kock, who has introduced the concept of stochastic value added, or SVA. SVA measures improvement in the difference between actual and forecasted distributions, giving a more complete picture of FEA, which just indicates improvements in the average error. Now, organizations can benefit from M1 findings if, first, they become aware of them, and second, they are aware of the inadequacies of their own process. Most organizations, if they measure forecast performance at all, are just measuring their final forecast and are probably just using some flavor of MAPE as their performance metric. But looking just at the final forecast only tells them the magnitude of their error. It has told them nothing about the quality of their forecast, whether it's any better than a naive forecast or any better than a simpler alternative forecasting process. It's by doing FEA, or better still, applying the enhancements to FEA developed by Stephen Willage and others, that you can assess the quality of your forecasting efforts, identify non-value added steps and activities, and streamline the process. Once an organization—
3 minutes left. 3 minutes left.
Once the organization has gone through the analysis and finally understands the nature of the problems in their forecasting process, this reveals the true opportunity that competition findings can bring. So I'll just wrap up quickly here, Maria, on a few general benefits of forecasting competitions and a few specific ones from M5. The first 5 were identified by Photios in a forthcoming IJF article organized with 60 co-authors, including many of the speakers at this conference and attendees. Number 1 is innovative new solutions that forecast more accurately. Well, these should be beneficial to organizations as long as the improvement is meaningful compared to existing methods. They aren't too complex or costly to implement, and of course, the organization actually starts using them. Likewise, number 2, understanding the conditions under which methods work or fail could save an organization forecasting related resources. The forecaster's efforts can be put behind the most promising approaches and not wasted on inappropriate approaches. I'm not sure if the next 3 directly apply to organizations, but I would perhaps certainly supporting competitions by providing data, as Walmart did, is a great way for organizations to contribute to the advancement of research. And I think I'd add a 5A that when you provide data to competitions, it does provide a direct benefit, and then you get to see what's achieved by these best state-of-the-art methods on your own data. And specific to M5, continue to develop machine learning algorithms. It also helps establish a range of realistic expectations from the naive and simple benchmarks up to the performance of the winners. And while I haven't seen any runtime reports for M5 methods, the M5 was very enlightening and shows running time for selected methods. And it showed while the 2 winners actually took hundreds of times longer to compute than the COM benchmark. And that one of the methods by Lagaki and Kutsuro actually performed not quite as well, but it did the 100,000 series in 25 minutes versus 6 days and 32 days for the 2 winning methods. So you might find similar methods in M5 that are strong performers at a fraction of the computational cost. So to end with just a call to action. First is a call to commercial software vendors to be faster, to adopt proven methods, or at least make it possible to forecast work easily with the latest advancement in open source. I'm happy that working friendly with open source was one of the major R&D advances at SAS before I retired from there in October. I would also suggest making combination models a default option rather than the software trying to select a single best model. And also, as Paul discussed yesterday, software needs to discourage the many time-wasting and accuracy-destroying forecast adjustments that are being made. And here, machine learning methods have shown promise in helping guide human adjustments. And the second call is just repeating the IGF articles going back to 1986 to encourage more research on the process and psychological issues. And here, the UFO project will take a big step in this direction. So that, thank you. I'd happy to connect any of you through this email or LinkedIn. And Spiros, thank you for letting me be part of this great event. You've given us 5 M competitions, and I hope you'll stick around and give us 5 more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. I think there is one question for you on the Q&A. One question, if you would like to respond to it.
Okay, let me see if I can get that called up. About segmenting product portfolio, that's certainly becoming a more popular approach, and I think it's a lot worth looking at. You may be able to find it to help you direct, and that's one thing. And Jeff had pointed to his article in Foresight, using different characteristics of the variability, whether it's something worthwhile or not to pursue. For example, if it's not really a worthwhile forecast, if it doesn't really matter very much whether you're accurate or not, it doesn't cost you much to keep extra inventory, just keep extra inventory and don't worry about it. So I think there's definitely some benefits you can find by going in and doing the analysis and focusing, of course, any kind of analysis you want to focus on those high value forecasts that really make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you very much.